Good afternoon, everyone. Settle in, make yourselves comfortable, and welcome to our monthly Hazardous Webinar series. So this is where we take a closer look at one of Natural Hazards Research Australia's research projects, its findings, and how to be translated into practice with members of the project team, as well as the people who use the research. So just to centre on why we're here today. So today's webinar is drawing on work that's happening in the project Natural Hazards and Resilience in Complex Urban Systems, which is being led out of RMIT University. My name's Dr. Blythe McLennan. I'm one of the Node Research Managers at Natural Hazards Research Australia, based in our Melbourne office, and I'm chairing the webinar for you today. Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all gathered here today from across a range of different Aboriginal lands. I'm a guest here on Wurundjeri country in Naarm or Melbourne, as I am wherever I walk in Australia, because sovereignty is not being ceded. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and also to any First Nations people joining us online today. These lands and waters across our country have always been places of teaching, of research, and of learning. And thank you to you all for joining us today. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a link to it and to any presentation materials will be made available in the coming weeks. Please let us know if you have any technical problems throughout the webinar. You can just add the details into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we have a team in the background who can help you troubleshoot any issues you might have. Questions will be answered at the end of a formal panel presentation. So please add your questions into the Q&A function at any time. Just make sure that you specify who your question's for, and we'll get to them in the last 15 minutes. We are very lucky to have a panel of 3 speakers, but four people assisting today. So Professor Jago Dodson is a Professor of Urban Policy at RMIT University, and he's also the Director of the Urban Futures Enabling Impact Platform. Jago has an extensive record of research into urban problems, addressing a wide array of housing, transport, urban planning, urban policy, governance, infrastructure, energy, and spatial labour market questions. Jago's joined as a speaker by Professor John Fain, who's a Professor of Practice at RMIT University. John's a multidisciplinary researcher, investigates questions and issues around the sustainability and resilience of urban community environments. He's worked in stakeholder engagement, capacity building, and research in disaster risk management and in natural resource management. So not presenting today, but joining us for Q&A is Dr. Annette Crone, who's a Senior Research Fellow in the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT University. She has a background in urban and regional planning, and she's worked in both Germany and Australia. Her research interests include the integration of urban planning and disaster management, resilience planning, and integrated land use and transport planning. We're thrilled to have Mel Dewsnap joining the RMIT team today as well. Mel's the Assistant Chief Resilience Officer for Resilience Sydney. Resilience Sydney is a collaboration of the 33 Greater Sydney councils working together with governments, business, academia, and community to strengthen the resilience of the city. Resilience City is also aligned with the Global Resilient Cities Network, which is focused on addressing risk and future-proofing cities for all. Now, we know that urban environments and the people who live there are exposed to multiple compounding and cascading natural hazard risks, which are further complicated by the effects of climate change. We only need to look at the LA fires to see a stark reminder of the increasing risk posed by just one natural hazard, wildfires, in urban environments. So the project we're hearing from today was developed to help us better understand natural hazard risks and impacts in urban environments, and how to prepare urban centres and those who live there to build resilience in the face of multidimensional impacts from natural hazards. So to get us started today, I'm very pleased to pass over to Jago, who's going to begin by letting you know a little bit more about the overall project. Thanks, Jago.
So thank you for that introduction, and it's a real delight to be participating in this webinar. I'm really just an introductory component of the presentation today, and I'll be handing over to John in a moment, who'll be giving the majority of the presentation. However, before doing so, please allow me, Blythe, to acknowledge the collaboration with NHRA throughout this project. It's been really terrific working with the agency as we've done this research, and also acknowledge the role you've played in guiding and shepherding us as the project has got underway, and as we've been working on it, and the great advice you've given us. I know you're moving on to a new role, but we've really enjoyed working with you over the last almost 2 years. As you know already now, I'm Jago Dodson. You can also see my colleague, John Feen, who's a co-leader of this project with me. The project's led out of RMIT University, but we've been working also with the Project Management Committee and also a wider stakeholder advisory group that spans the entirety of Australia. So even though it's Melbourne-based, it's looking across the country. So this project is about natural hazards and resilience in complex urban systems. It's taking a view effectively of large cities and trying to understand the vulnerabilities to multidimensional compounding, cascading, interacting disaster impacts that cities might face. We're not really focusing on regional contexts or rural contexts, ex-urban contexts. We're really focusing on major cities that have that complexity across all the urban systems that they contain and depend on. We're trying to understand how to better build urban resilience and reduce disaster risk. As Blythe mentioned, some cities around the world have faced pretty significant impacts from disasters in recent times. So we're hoping the project will help with that task. Another part of the project is to look at resilience strategies and investment. So what kind of frameworks, approaches can emergency management and disaster response managers, as well as land use, housing policy makers, put in place in terms of strategies and investments to proactively respond to disaster risk. And then a major component of the project, which we're sort of moving into now, partly with this webinar, is to communicate and disseminate the insights from the projects to all the stakeholder collaborators and audiences that we're working with. So the project is organised through 4 main work packages. The first work package is to understand the state of knowledge of multidimensional compounding, cascading, and disaster impacts in relation to complex urban systems. And John has been leading that work package and will be speaking about some of the insights he's gained from that in a moment. The second work package is looking at practices, so approaches, frameworks, etc., that practitioners especially can use to conceptualize and map the vulnerabilities and the points of resilience within complex urban systems. And then the third work package is looking at practices and processes to prioritize, influence, develop, undertake urban resilience investments and the kind of decision-making frameworks that might be brought to bear on that task. And then the fourth work package is to pull all this together to identify the learnings, the insights that we've drawn through the project, and to communicate and translate those into practical outcomes for the stakeholder community associated with the NHRA. So we're currently in that phase, and we're running until the end of the year with that work. In terms of the research translation and the kind of outcomes we're anticipating from the research, one output we've produced so far is a practical guidance tool, which is a kind of a guided tool or approach to working through how to map vulnerabilities and resilience at local scales that can help policymakers, practitioners understand the risks that they might face in their local context. And then we're using that as a kind of case study in how to develop practical guidance tools. So if anyone would like to be involved in that process, I'll put a QR code up in the moment that you can find out a bit more about that. In relation to the resilience investments, we're developing draft processes and principles through which policymakers and practitioners can prioritise and influence those investments, and then also drafting guidance on monitoring and evaluation of urban resilience investments. That work isn't quite complete, but we're hoping to finish it fairly soon. And then a kind of a final set of translation outcomes from the project will be some capability resources, so some brochures, guidebooks, pamphlets, mostly online, I would expect, rather than hard copy, that practitioners and policymakers can look to and adopt and use to put into practice the insights of the project and the advice that's come through it. We have a couple of QR codes. If you'd like to know about the project overall, you can scan the code on the left-hand side. If you'd like to put in an EOI, a very brief EOI, doesn't require a lot of effort, an EOI to be part of the proof of concept study, then please scan the right-hand side code and they'll grab your details and then we'll be in touch to talk about how you can be involved. So that's an overview of the project. Really great to have been able to present to everyone today. And I'm now delighted to hand over to John, who's going to talk a little bit more in detail about complex urban systems and systemic risk. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Jago, and thank you everyone behind organising our webinar today and the wonderful audience from around Australia that we know are here. This morning, as I was preparing for the final sort of looking over my notes, I took time out for a coffee and looked at the crossword puzzle in the newspaper. And here was one of the clues. 7 letters. The 5th and 7th letters were H and N, and the clue was make more resilient. I knew it straight away. It was strengthen. And then I counted it out, and strengthen was 10 letters, not 7. So I'm going to have to wait tomorrow to find out myself how to make things more resilient. So maybe I'm not the person who should be actually talking today. In Australia, we've had quite a long relationship with this idea of systemic risk, and those dates should be around the other way, because we actually published a book on systemic disaster risk in Australia in 2021, and the whole UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction didn't get theirs out until the following year. On top of that, a month ago, Lauren Rickards presented a Resilience Matter ADA webinar on systems thinking and hazards and disasters. And of course, those who are going to be at the AFAC and ADA conferences in Perth next week will know that on the Friday, then the Monash Fires to Flourish group are having a whole day training session on systemic risk and ways of dealing and managing it. So that there's main things we're going to focus on today are actually how is urban resilience related to systemic risk. The crocodile on the left is what we might call a part of a simple system, whereas on the right-hand side, where we have a diagram of a city, we see that there are enormous systemic risks that flow from the biophysical environment and the socio-economic, political and cultural environments. We have systems boundaries in the green and the light blue shading, and each of those dots represent different system elements or components, and the lines between them are the way they link up in systems and subsystems, with the dotted lines letting us see that there's interactions going on within and with outside the system, and the little double curly are our feedback loops, and we've got compound risk and cascading impacts. So compared to simple risks, systemic risks are really complicated. In fact, they are part of that sort of category of problems that are called wicked problems. And cities, I'm so pleased there's so many local government people with us today. Towns and cities, urban settlements are really complex systems, as we saw in the diagram on the right. And not only does the complexity come from the number of systems, but from those multiple interactions that are constantly occurring between them. Now, as well as being complex systems, cities are also multi-level and open systems. They're multi-level in that there's the biophysical, ecological system, there are socioeconomic systems, and there's the built-in environment. And all of those are interacting not only within their own system, but also across the levels within those spatial patterns. But as well as being complex, cities are also open systems. And so we can see in the diagram on the left, 3 cities with their multiple systems linked together. And even in the boundaries, there are relationships between the city, the peri-urban and the rural. And there's even links with those open boundaries taking us out to regional, national and global networks. So it's very hard to start to make predictions about what might happen with hazards and risk when they're all so dynamic and evolving. And it's just so difficult to start to think about planning for disaster risk reduction, recovery, and planning for resilience, both before and after a disaster, because of the great levels of complexity and the openness of the systems. Given that complexity, cities are a particular type of system, one that people who work in complexity theory call complex adaptive systems. And they've got complex adaptive systems have got special characteristics that you can see on the right from the teardrops. Because of the interactions that are constantly occurring between the systems and subsystems, what we start to find is that cause and effect gets to be hidden. Very rarely does a single cause have a linear result. In fact, complex adaptive systems like cities actually have non-linear relationships. And so with that unpredictability comes a degree of adaptability, of self-organization, and particularly of emergence. And as it says on the left, when disruptions occur in a complex adaptive system, such as an urban settlement, they've got the capacity not just to self-organize, but to continually reorganize their elements, subsystems and patterns, and even the impacts of those interactions. What tends to happen is that cities are more than the sum of the individual parts, particularly when disruption occurs. That self-organization leads to new properties emerging. Sometimes the socioeconomic system makes planning and disaster risk reduction systems that we think are very, very wise. But given the adaptability and the lack of predictability in systems, sometimes those turn out to be maladaptions. And this really brings us back to trying to understand the importance of decision-making and governance in towns and cities. What we tend to find is that the complexity relates in cities, like all complex adaptive systems, being multidimensional: social, economic, political, technological, legal, political, and so on. But also a number of hazards can occur simultaneously or just after each other. And so they compound and multiply, and their impacts cascade through the systems and change over time. And there's just a wonderful book which has got mainly Australian editors and authors there on the left that I'd recommend to you. And just imagine that we had time, we could go through what all of those 4 characteristics mean. But just given our limited time this afternoon, let's take the example of cascading impacts. And imagine there's a power station that's normally located near a river for cooling. The river floods, the power station floods, and there goes the energy supply. And as the energy supply closes down, then there are multiple cascading impacts across the various systems and subsystems, which makes it really difficult to make plans for how to make this one example of critical infrastructure, a power station, resilient to natural hazards and the risks that they pose. It lets us know that resilience is something that we need to be planning before risks turn into disasters. One wonderful tool that is available for considering what happens and to plan for cascading impacts was prepared for us by the wonderful Doug Payton, where he indicates it's possible to have an interdependence matrix and to score them, 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of the depth or the height of their dependence, and map out and know which are the crucial cascades that need to be addressed in preparing to strengthen critical infrastructure for resilience. I saw a wonderful word called not recovery, but pre-covery, which is the preparing for recovery before any disruption occurs. And I think that interdependence matrix is a great way of looking at that. We often think that resilience is something that has to be built or developed, but in actual fact, all towns and cities have got a degree of resilience already. And we can see the classic disaster cycle in the outside blue of the square, and recognize that for each of those, our cities have already got some capacities to prepare, to absorb impacts, to recover, or even to change the systems themselves. And so it's not a matter of building resilience, but rather than enhancing or enhancing or enriching. The inherent resilience, of course, varies enormously, not just between towns and cities, but also within. We know that these inherent resilient capacities are unevenly distributed across society and in different urban centres. And it's necessary in strengthening resilience to be focusing upon which of the capacities for which demographic groups most need to have that inherent degree of resilience strengthened. And it's here where planned resilience becomes important. It's here that we've got decisions to make in terms of planning for resilience. And it really depends on what we're going to do, what we're going to plan, really depends upon how we define resilience. Are we seeing resilience purely in terms of the resilience against the risks, and so seeking to address the drivers of the shocks and disruptions? Or are we going to be seeing resilience as actions, as something where we try to reduce the stresses, the inequalities that intensify vulnerabilities and lead hazards and risks to become disasters? For which groups of people in what parts of cities do different capacities need strengthening? And often we realize that we don't have an ideal world when we realize that there are transaction costs involved. How much change to make resilience can society tolerate? What transaction costs will they bear? And it's here I found this wonderful diagram that indicates that if we're seeking to build resilience, there are a number of approaches we can take, and they're on a continuum, as you can see by the horizontal lines. And resilience, coming back to how we might define it, resilience is about stability. It's about capacity to rebound and to persist, for systems to return to their normal functions. And that is an important part of absorbing and resisting the disruptions that occur. Though I've seen a wonderful article called "Your Seawall Won't Save You." And so we actually need to see resilience as not just building, returning and bouncing back to what we were, but to see a greater degree of flexibility in terms of building forward or bouncing forward, building back better, or even taking actions before disruption occurs by building the adaptive capacity of not just society or the physical environment, but both. Or if we're seeking, maximal change, then we need to look at, well, what are the transformational responses? If we know that people who are less fortunate than others, for a variety of reasons, they are the ones who are impacted the most by hazards, risks, and disasters. So what can be done about addressing inequalities as a way of weakening the stresses that maximize impacts? Resilience involves all of those types of actions. We get that normal idea that there are different forms of resilience, and those various capacities of absorbing and resisting shocks often leads to levee banks, sea walls, stronger building codes, fire breaks, and often that's been called engineering resilience. In terms of adaptations, then we have nature-based solutions, education, community, capacity building, urban farming, a great variety of ways of building socio-ecological resilience. Or in transformative resilience, it's really about climate and disaster justice to reduce those socioeconomic vulnerabilities in order to fundamentally change power and resilience dynamics in a society, and a variety of strategies that are available for that. Very often, the good books tell us that transformative resilience is better than engineering or socio-ecological resilience. So if we see on the horizontal axis are the variety of characteristics of resilience: coordination, social inclusion, systems redundancy, robustness, and strength. And on the vertical axis, it talks about what's the level of resilience, and you can see there on the scale. But I don't think really that that's true. I think that we need to be seeing all approaches to resilience as being necessary, because resilience can't be built on a global scale. Resilience, perhaps, we talk about resilience and national security, so it's obviously got some sort of national dimension, but in terms of hazard risk, resilience needs to be built from the local scale. And I'm so pleased now to be able to hand over to Resilience Sydney to identify what are the ways that they're looking at addressing the need for using resilience to address systemic risk. So thank you, Melinda.
Thank you so much, John. And thanks so much for the invite to join you all today. So much food for thought and such a great overview presented just then. I'm now going to ladder us across to Resilience Sydney and look at the context for resilience in this place-based way. So firstly, who is Resilience Sydney? We are the 33 local councils across Greater Sydney, and we're working together to build stronger communities and a more resilient city. Resilience Sydney has been operating since 2015, when it initially received Rockefeller Foundation funding to commence. and launched its first strategy in 2018, which ran through to 2024. And I'm going to give you a bit of an outline of what we've done and also where we're going under our new strategy. And importantly, Resilient Sydney is governed by a regional Greater Sydney Steering Committee with our council's CEOs and general managers and state and non-profit and industry partners. So firstly, what is resilience? And we've heard a lot about that today, but also just picking up John's comment around how we define this is critical. And we use the definition that has been adopted by the Global Resilient Cities Network. And we are one of the over 100 global cities that is part of this group. So we define it as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, and businesses, and our systems within a city to survive, adapt, and thrive, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks we experience. As we all know, disasters, disruptions, and chronic stresses know no boundaries. And resilience is very much a team sport. Resilience planning at a regional scale has cost saving and operational efficiencies across government. It supports more effective ways to share responsibility for managing risks between those levels of government, agencies, and community. Here we see Greater Sydney, which is hugely diverse in terms of our environment, our infrastructure, and also communities. And this is, of course, where 66% of the New South Wales population live. And this area is, of course, growing. And so, like other global cities, we are really dealing with the challenges and the opportunities of urban growth and coupling that within the real structural forces and challenges that we face, such as a rapidly changing climate. In terms of the role of Resilient Sydney, so firstly, we need to jointly understand the risks for Greater Sydney. If we don't know what we're facing and we're not working together and sharing that understanding and the data that underpins that, it's very difficult to collaborate to address it. So that's our first focus. We then worked to identify shared priorities and opportunities to work together and respond to our region-wide shocks and stresses in Sydney, and are working to build the capacity of our sector through learning, information and data sharing, building our organisational resilience and supporting community resilience. And importantly, we are focused on overcoming the challenges of a complex governance environment. We have 33 councils in Greater Sydney, all working with the state government and the Australian government and countless other institutions, organisations, and of course, our communities. We need a coordinated approach in how we do this. There are an increasing number of state and national frameworks that are very relevant to what we do as local government, how we do it, and how we work across government and with communities. We need a coordinated way to make sure that we are doing this efficiently, we are learning together, and we are also securing the investment pathways to ensure that local government has the ability to deliver and face the challenges that are coming to us. So end of April this year, we launched our latest Resilient Sydney strategy, and this takes us through to the end of this critical decade. This is building on the legacy and achievements of the first Resilient Sydney strategy, and that really served us well. So we learned over that time how to move beyond our boundaries, how to collaborate across government, and we managed to navigate our way through the economic, social, and environmental disasters and disruptions that we faced with our communities at that time. And that was significant. So we had over 12 declared disasters in Sydney in the time of the first strategy, including bushfires, storms, and floods. We went through heat waves, infrastructure and network failures, as well as a pandemic. So all of this has affected the well-being and the security of our communities and also cost our economy billions of dollars. So the vision for our strategy is stronger together and prepared for the future. And our mission is to collaborate to address risk at a city scale. On the Resilient Sydney website, we have our strategy, which I will give a snapshot of today, but also importantly, the foundational reports, our youth engagement report, our synthesis report, and our overall engagement report. So these are a really fantastic resource, not just for local government, but for all sectors, as they join up the findings from our technical assessment with the needs and the aspirations of our diverse communities across Sydney. We had 32 of our Sydney mayors all sign on to this mayoral statement, and we have had ongoing fantastic support across local government. And I would particularly just like to shout out to my colleagues from Parramatta, Ryde, Northern Beaches and Randwick who are on this webinar today, and also all of our other local government colleagues as well. We know that these resilience challenges cannot be faced individually, but the commitment to work together and collaborate around action has been truly inspiring to see across our Resilient Sydney network. So the Global Resilient Cities Network provides a city resilience framework to assess strengths and weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our cities, and has also done a lot around global drivers of risk. And this framework was utilised in the formation of the strategy for Greater Sydney. There were two key components, and the first was a very detailed technical resilience risk assessment, and this was coupled with very extensive community and expert stakeholder engagement across all phases of strategy development. We applied an all hazards risk assessment, which looked at the likelihood of shocks and stresses, and also looked to the national trends, the global drivers, regional stresses, and also really investigated the vulnerable assets and services across our city. And I would really like to acknowledge the incredible work of Beck Dawson, Yvette Andrews, and the whole team who led this work, and also all of the councils who played such a key role in forming this up. So here we see some fantastic photos from some of our engagement, and we really realised through the development of the strategy that people have a really deep desire to have meaningful conversations about the challenges facing Sydney. Our community knows we need to move across our boundaries, step out of silos, and work together with a common goal for a stronger future for Sydney. And coupled with the workshops and engagements that happened across Sydney, we also had a fantastic deliberative democracy process, which really drew in people who represented all the different, the demographic diversity of our communities across Sydney. So I think the level of engagement and how in-depth this was has really proved to be globally leading. And we have recently presented to the Global Resilient Cities Network on this process. And along with Paris and Rotterdam are the only other two global cities who have done their second resilient strategies. So here, just a snapshot of that engagement, which I just spoke to and was critical and also foundational for all the work that we do, which will continue to be community-led. And we know that local government is the most trusted level of government. It's the level of government most connected to community. And we really need to make sure that we're bringing up that community voice in everything we do in this space. So in regard to the shocks and stresses for Sydney, these are not particularly surprising to most people on the call. So the Comprehensive Resilience Risk Assessment really did a deep dive into the shocks that we're facing. And these were clustered under international crisis, natural hazards, and these are all aligned with the State Disaster Mitigation Plan, and also critical infrastructure failure. And as we heard from John earlier, our hazards, risks, our impacts, and our shocks, they are all multidimensional and they are all compounding and cascading in different ways. So one of these can exacerbate multiple other shock events and is also very much impacted by the underlying stresses in our city. So these weaken the fabric of our city on a day-to-day basis, and they increase the vulnerability of our communities. These can be related to geography and demographics. And we saw a real increase in some of these stresses over the time of our first Resilient Sydney strategy to our latest one. So firstly, we have growing inequity across our city. We have a growing divide, and this really means that our communities are less able to be prepared and respond to the shock events that we face. And that growing inequity also is very much linked with some of these governance stresses, particularly low trust in government and other things that reduce the social license that we have to act. So we have a lot of work collectively to do to recognise and address this inequity across the city. Well-being also came up very strongly in the latest strategy, particularly mental health, and also growing social isolation. So we know people are feeling more disconnected than ever before, and this is also changing with the changing dwelling structure in our cities. We know that people have a lower level of trust and connection who live in apartment buildings. And of course, we have growing residential density across our city, and half of Sydney-siders will live in apartments by 2040. So a lot of these things are very interrelated and interconnected, and we are looking across as local governments and how we partner with state government and our other stakeholders to address these things is key. So governance was another key stress. So I've already touched on the fragmented governance across Sydney. We know that social cohesion is reducing, and we are working in a context of declining trust, and also the environmental degradation and ecological challenges that we face are growing. So we need to make sure that our action and our solutions speak to and address our stresses and our shocks if we are to create a more resilient Sydney. So here we've got our 5 wrapped up resilience challenges for Greater Sydney. Firstly, our environment is under increasing pressure, and we are seeing increasing intensity and frequency of extreme climate change induced weather events. So extreme weather is also the key risk identified under the Global Risk Report presented by the World Bank for 2025, and is something that global cities are tackling. And this sort of ongoing structural force and risk is impacting all parts of not only our communities and the resilience of our people, but also our systems, our citywide systems, structures and institutions, and so on. So these are linked with our directions, which are the backbone of our strategy. And hence the first one is a city where we care for the environment. We recognise we are part of it and dependent on the ecological services it provides, and we are living in a sustainable way. Next, inequitable services and opportunities across Sydney. Hence, direction 2 is a people-centred city. How do we create a more equitable city with climate-resilient neighbourhoods? Next, depleted community resilience. There is a growing sense of fatigue and uncertainty, and this also differed dependent on the place and where we engaged people across Sydney. We know everyone has gone through a huge amount over the past 5 years, but for some communities, they have been continually hit by disaster after disaster, and they are facing greater disproportionate stresses than other parts of our city. So direction 3 is focused on connection for strength. How do we build a more inclusive city that really drives social connection and community agency and leadership? There was a real reflection from the community that we learn our lessons as government. How do we reflect on what has come out of COVID, what has come out of our previous disaster events and prepare and respond in differing ways. So we're working with across government, with Reconstruction Authority, with the Australian Red Cross, with many partners to make sure we are ready. How do we boost up preparedness and make sure that we are connecting, collaborating and coordinating across all of our communities in a really coherent, clear way? And lastly, the complex governance. So One City. Resilient Sydney is all about how do we ladder up, how are we bigger than the sum of our parts, how do we strive forward for a more resilient, future-proofed Sydney, and how do we do that in an efficient way where we can deliver the best outcomes for our communities. So this next slide just gives you a taster of our strategy on a page, and you can find more detail in our strategy document. This gives you an idea of the 30 actions that nest under these 5 directions. All of these actions have what we call action pathways, which are iterative steps to work toward achieving those actions. And it's really important to note that this strategy is a roadmap for partnership and a roadmap for collaboration. It has come from community, it's come from 33 councils, it's been informed by our colleagues in state and the Australian government, and also all of our key institutions and stakeholders across Sydney. So this is a way for us to strive to work together to become a more resilient Sydney. Peppered through the document are also fantastic case studies and stories of hope. So the challenges that we face are significant. However, there are so many fantastic initiatives already underway that are scalable. And so I also encourage you to have a look at those. And that's my final slide. Thank you so much. And back to you, Blythe.
Thanks so much, Mel. And I'll just ask all panelists, and Annette included, to pop your videos on, and we've got about 5 minutes left to do some questions. I actually really liked hearing John's presentation and then yours back to back, Mel, because as I was thinking of, questions to pose and discuss at the end, I was thinking as John was speaking, if I was say an emergency management planner in an urban local government and I wanted to adapt plans to attend to cities as complex adaptive systems, how would I start doing that? And then I think looking at what you've done, Mel, and what the strategies contained is kind of showing a way forward, and how the Resilient Cities program is doing that in quite a comprehensive and a quite a nuanced way. So it was lovely to see those two together. We have a couple of questions from the audience. So just in the interest of time, I'll park my question and go to the audience one so that I can tend to audience questions first. And I might we'll go to the first one. So, and you talked about, Mel, about inequalities, and John and Mel, both, you've referred to scale, and we know systems are multi-scaled, there are interactions across scale. So there's a question here around, and this is picking up on a comment that you made, John, so I'll throw to you first. If resilience is best built at a local scale, how can that approach actually address systemic issues like racism, inequality, which are systemic problems that do require that multi-scale action? And it also saying that systemic issues amplify vulnerabilities and are amplified by disaster. So I guess that's getting to that scale or scales at which we work question. So to you, John, first, and then you might want to answer to that as well, Mel.
Yeah. Obviously, it's a multi-scale problem, and I think I'd use the example of the marvellous work that's been taking place over the last 4 years in northern New South Wales, where the state government has worked so incredibly closely with the variety of local governments and directly with communities, with some sort of generous federal as well as state funding behind it. So the multi-scaler, I think, is essential, but the detailed work that needs to be done in the risk assessment and the essentially what let's call now the Sydney process in the development of that strategy does need to take place at the local level in collaboration with the people who live there, as we saw in Sydney, plus also where the power and resources lie in the nature of governance in Australia.
Yeah, that's great. And Mel, you spoke a lot to the collaboration and engagement with community as well at local scale, but also coordination across the councils in the Greater Sydney area. Is there anything you wanted to add to that about that working at different scales through the strategy?
Yeah, I think it is essential that we do that. And a really good example is the Greater Sydney Heat Smart City Plan. Heat is our key risk for Greater Sydney, and we need that coordination at a state level where we're working with, through the Heat Task Force, with multiple state government departments. But then we also need to understand that the way heat impacts communities in Penrith is also very different to how it impacts communities in Sutherland. So having that hyper local application of response and community awareness building, emergency application in terms of heat response, etc., is essential. However, we need this to be coordinated at a Greater Sydney and a state level as well. So we've got that efficiency at scale, and we've got the investment delivered, and the coordination around messaging and response. So we do need this to happen on multiple scales, but coordinating, we don't have time to recreate wheels or do a whole lot of different things individually across 33 councils. We've got experts in all councils. We need to ladder up and scale the solutions we've got in a coordinated way that addresses the risk for us at a regional scale.
Yeah, great response. Thank you. There's another question here for John, but I think I might throw it to you, Annette, because I think it will inadvertently be a plug for the guidance tool that you're developing and working on. So this is a question around how can the resilience of a city as a system be assessed? Are there any frameworks available for doing that? And how can we claim that a system has bounced forward? And I know there's some content related to that in the guidance tool that you're developing. So just maybe 1 minute and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Blythe. And yeah, maybe very quickly, there are actually quite a lot of frameworks out there. Sometimes it's probably hard to understand which one is this fitting one for your city. Within the project, we have actually looked at a lot of the Australian ones. We're not claiming that we looked at every framework, but we have summarized quite a few of them. And in that practical guidance tool that Jago mentioned and Blythe just mentioned as well, we've kind of drawn together a lot of the findings from what we found when we looked at it. And it's not another tool in that sense, but it is a tool that is supposed to help you actually try to understand what your process is like. Is there maybe is something missing in that process? So it's kind of a summary of a lot of frameworks. So hopefully that will be helpful. And if you would like to test the practical guidance tool, Joe has put the link in the chat before, and we had up that QR code. So we would love to hear feedback to understand how useful it actually is for practitioners. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. And we will send out, so I think when we send out the video and presentation material, we'll send out a link to the Resilient Sydney strategy, so people can access and look at the content that Mel introduced to us, and that EOI sign up to for the EOI to take part in testing that guidance, because that does have some great resources in there and summaries of frameworks and things that already exist. So thank you all. Thanks to Jago, John, Annette and Melinda for taking time to share the work on this project and talk about how we can support cities to become more resilient in the face of natural hazards. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us online. We were really pleased to see so many local government people sign up today. It's wonderful to see you all here. The recording, as I said, will be made available. It'll be online next week, and you'll get an email with the link and other material. Just to let you know, we have another webinar next week that is actually looking at research lessons we can take so far out of the tragic July 2025 Texas floods and what that experience can mean for Australia. So that'll be a fantastic webinar for you to join up to as well. And then for updates of everything to do with Natural Hazards Research Australia, so this project, forthcoming webinars, consider signing up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. We share a lot of information. And thank you, everyone. And I won't be here next time, but there'll be others from NHRA and other projects that will be here for the webinars next month. So NHRA will see you then. Thank you.